My husband has been hesitating to sleep with me lately. When I confronted him, he told me I was too demanding and needed to stop making everything a problem. Lately, something has changed between us. My husband and I used to share a connection that felt effortless, warm touches, late-night whispers, and the unspoken understanding that no matter how hard life got, we had each other. But now, there's a distance I can't ignore. It started subtly, fewer kisses before bed, a distracted look in his eyes, and nights where he turned away instead of pulling me close. At first, I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, or just one of those phases couples go through. But as the nights stretched into weeks, I could no longer deny it. My husband was avoiding intimacy with me. I tried to brush it off, pretending not to notice the way he stiffened when I reached for his hand or how he'd sigh, almost as if in frustration, when I nestled against him at night. But the more I ignored it, the more the silence between us grew. And silence, I've learned, is often the loudest warning sign in a relationship. I started analyzing everything. Had I done something wrong? Had I changed in a way he wasn't attracted to anymore? My mind raced through every possibility, dissecting our past few months together. I thought about the arguments we'd had, nothing major, just the usual disagreements that any couple faces. But was there something deeper I had overlooked? In bed, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my body tense with unspoken frustration. The rejection wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It made me feel unwanted, undesired, and, worst of all, unlovable. One night, as he climbed into bed beside me, I turned to him. "You've been distant," I said softly, choosing my words carefully. "You barely touch me anymore. What's going on?" He sighed, rubbing his face, before looking at me. For a moment, I thought he'd finally open up, finally tell me what had been weighing on his mind. But instead, his answer knocked the air from my lungs. "You're too demanding," he said, flatly. "You always make everything a problem." I stared at him, stunned. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Like I was exhausting him. Like my need for closeness, for intimacy, was an inconvenience. I felt my chest tighten. Demanding? Had I really been asking for too much? Was wanting affection, wanting my husband to want me, an unreasonable expectation? As he turned his back to me and shut his eyes, I lay there in the dark, my mind racing. His words had opened a wound I didn't even realize was there, and now, I had no choice but to face the painful truth: something was deeply wrong between us. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I was the one to blame. I barely slept that night. My husband's words echoed in my mind: "You're too demanding. You always make everything a problem." I kept replaying our conversation, trying to understand. Was I really too much? Had I been suffocating him without realizing it? Or was this just an excuse, his way of avoiding something deeper? By morning, I had convinced myself that I needed to take a step back, to stop pushing for answers. Maybe if I gave him space, he would come back to me on his own. But as the days passed, nothing changed. If anything, the distance between us grew wider. He stopped initiating any form of affection. His kisses became quick and mechanical, his hugs lacking warmth. If I reached for him, he would respond, but only out of obligation, not desire. Nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed, my body tense, waiting for him to turn toward me, to pull me close like he used to. But he never did. I started overanalyzing everything. Was I being too clingy? Too emotional? I became hyper-aware of my own behavior, questioning every word I said and every touch I offered. If I leaned in for a kiss, I hesitated, worried he might pull away. If I brought up how I was feeling, I second-guessed whether I was being too much again. But no matter how hard I tried to shrink myself, to make my needs smaller, the feeling of rejection never went away. And then, the doubts began creeping in. What if it wasn't me? What if there was someone else? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never doubted my husband's loyalty before, but now, I couldn't ignore the signs. The late nights spent on his phone, the sudden urge to sleep on the farthest edge of the bed, the way he seemed more irritated when I tried to engage him in conversation. I started noticing the little things, how he kept his phone closer than usual, how he would sigh in frustration when I asked him about his day, how he seemed relieved when I stopped trying. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my insecurities get the best of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, after another silent dinner where he barely looked at me, I couldn't take it anymore. "Is there someone else?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if weighing his next words carefully. Then, he scoffed and shook his head. "Seriously," he muttered, pushing his plate away. "This is exactly what I mean. You're always looking for a problem." His dismissal stung more than if he had just admitted to something. He didn't reassure me. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He just made me feel crazy for even asking. That night, as I lay awake in bed beside him, I realized something painful. Whether there was someone else or not, the man lying next to me was no longer the man I had married. And maybe I wasn't the same woman either. I woke up the next morning feeling hollow. The doubt, the frustration, the loneliness, it was all beginning to weigh on me in ways I couldn't ignore. My husband's response the night before still rang in my head. "You're always looking for a problem." No denial, no reassurance, just dismissal. But I wasn't looking for a problem, I was looking for my husband. I was looking for the man who once held me close at night, who kissed my forehead just because, who made me feel like I was the center of his world. And now, I was starting to wonder if that man even existed anymore. For days, I debated whether to bring it up again. Part of me wanted to let it go, to pretend everything was fine. Maybe if I stopped pressing, things would go back to normal. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was just too much. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. One evening, after another silent dinner, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of everything I had been holding inside was suffocating me. If I didn't speak now, I never would. I put my fork down, took a deep breath, and forced myself to say the words that had been sitting on my tongue for weeks. "I can't do this anymore." He looked up at me, confused. "Do what?" "This," I gestured between us. "Pretending that everything is okay when it's not." He sighed, rubbing his temple like he was already exhausted by the conversation. "Here we go again," he muttered under his breath. That reaction alone nearly broke me. But I pushed forward. "I need to understand what's happening," I said, my voice steady but desperate. "You've been distant for weeks. You don't touch me. You don't talk to me. And when I try to bring it up, you make me feel like I'm crazy for noticing." His jaw tightened. "Because you are making it a bigger deal than it is." "That's not fair." My voice cracked, but I refused to back down. "I'm your wife. It is a big deal when you stop wanting to be close to me. It's a big deal when I feel like a stranger in my own marriage." He exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, looking at me like I was exhausting him. "I don't know what you want me to say." I felt my heart sink. That was it? That was all he had to offer? "Try the truth," I said. "Are you unhappy? Do you not want me anymore?" His lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer right away. And in that silence, my worst fears took shape. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. "I just don't have the energy to deal with this right now." "This? Me?" His silence was deafening. Tears burned at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wasn't going to beg for his love. Not when he was acting like it was a burden. I pushed back my chair and stood up, my hands trembling. "I deserve more than this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, locking myself in the bedroom while he remained in the dining room, unmoved, unaffected. And that night, for the first time since we got married, I didn't care if he crawled into bed beside me. Because I finally understood that I wasn't losing him. I had already lost him. The next morning, I woke up alone. The other side of the bed was empty, the sheets untouched. At some point in the night, my husband had chosen to sleep elsewhere. Maybe the couch. Maybe anywhere that wasn't next to me. And for the first time in weeks, that realization didn't bring me pain. It brought me clarity. I had spent so much time questioning myself, wondering if I was asking for too much, if I was the problem, if I needed to change to make him love me the way he once did. But last night had given me the answer I had been too afraid to admit. It wasn't me. It was us. Our love had changed. Or maybe it had faded. Maybe he had grown tired of me, or maybe he had simply stopped trying. Either way, I was done making excuses for him. I walked into the kitchen, half expecting him to be there, waiting to apologize, waiting to fight for us. But the room was empty. Just a plate in the sink, a half-drunk cup of coffee on the counter. Signs of a man who had woken up, gone through the motions of his day, and left without a second thought. That hurt. More than I wanted to admit. I sat down at the table, staring at the spot where he had been the night before. The way he had looked at me, cold, distant, like I was exhausting him, lingered in my mind. I thought about all the times I had tried to reach for him, only to be met with reluctance. I thought about how he had made me feel small for wanting love, for wanting intimacy, for wanting him. And then I thought about something even more important. What about me? What about the woman who had spent nights questioning her worth, because her husband no longer looked at her the way he used to? What about the woman who had shrunk herself, who had walked on eggshells, who had begged, silently, desperately, for something that should have been given freely? I didn't want to be that woman anymore. When my husband finally came home that evening, I was waiting for him. Not with anger. Not with tears. Just with the truth. "I'm done," I said simply. He blinked, caught off guard. Done with what? With this. With feeling like I have to beg my own husband to love me. With making myself smaller just so you don't feel suffocated. With staying in a marriage where I feel like a burden instead of a partner. He didn't respond right away. And that silence told me everything. Maybe he had expected me to keep fighting. To keep chasing him, keep proving my worth, keep trying. But love isn't something you should have to beg for. And I refused to beg any longer. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" he finally asked, his voice unreadable. I took a deep breath. I didn't know what the next step looked like. Maybe it was counseling. Maybe it was time apart. Or maybe it was walking away for good. But what I did know was this: whatever happened next, I wouldn't lose myself in the process. "I'm saying I deserve more than this," I said. And for the first time in a long time, I meant it.